You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now more of our conversation with African American Studies professor Keith Mayes. Over the years, we've seen the U.S. Supreme Court deal with issues related to affirmative action. And just this past June, the court threw out a key provision of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Tell us about that, and are these slowly whittling away at some of the progress that was made during the civil rights movement in the 1960s?
You know, that's a very good question in that the language of the law is so simple yet so complex. The Civil Rights Act of '64 is based on the provisions that are found in the 14th Amendment, right? That says due process of law, equal protection of the laws. Civil Rights Act also has that same language, and it's called colorblind language. So no discrimination should take place both ways. We know the intent of the legislation was to deal with black and brown people and then women, but if the language of the law is colorblind, then other people can say, wait a minute now, isn't that program you have at that university, isn't it discriminatory? And isn't it discriminatory in a reverse way? Because it says that no one shall be discriminated against. So in a real backwards, reverse way, people have been able to use the language of these laws. Same thing with the Constitution. 14th Amendment doesn't really say much about color, right? So I think that it's unfortunate that people have not understood the historical reasons why these laws have come into practice and have used it in a way to sort of galvanize a certain part of the American public to believe that certain groups are getting an upper hand when it comes to fairness and equality and justice. But people should really study why the law had come into practice, had come into being in the first place, and then they would have a better understanding of why these laws are necessary. Now, voter ID laws may look very harmless and generic on the face of them, but in many ways you can argue that they are no different from literacy tests or grandfather clauses or poll taxes, which again, very race-neutral state laws passed in the late 19th century, early 20th century. They really don't say anything about color. Neither does voter ID. So we still need to have at least checks and balances on the laws, the local laws passed by states, when they have the effect of discriminating and keeping people from in the case of the Voting Rights Act, keeping people off the rolls. In the case of the Civil Rights Act, keeping people from getting resources and getting into institutions like universities and colleges, et cetera. So we just have to be careful.
After President Barack Obama was elected for the first time in 2008, the term post-racial society entered our lexicon. But we still see huge disparities in income and education between whites and blacks.
Yes.
How are these issues being confronted today, and how are the tactics used to confront them different from what they were back during the civil rights movement in the 1960s?
Yes, I think that in many ways, President Obama's elections, plural, has done two things. One, set back the black movement in that it still gives the impression that African Americans are doing okay. Now, certainly one can make the argument that they are doing much better today than a generation ago. That's true. But the mere fact that you have a black president doesn't mean that you don't have these historical inequalities. You don't have these current day disparities. And when you look at K through 12 education, when you look at the prison population, or look at healthcare, if you look at many areas of our lives as Americans, African Americans suffer the worst. So, the civil rights movement has a dual legacy. Opened the doors for so many different African Americans, but it also did not touch or left behind many African Americans as well. It just didn't do as much as it could have. A lot of that has to do with the white resistance over the decades, trying to roll back some of these pieces of legislation successfully, affirmative action being rolled back, et cetera. But I think that one has to at least acknowledge the political times that we live in, and we live in very conservative times, and it's just not politically correct to be liberal, to be black liberal or white liberal. It's hard to be a progressive in the second decade of the 21st century, because I think the country is maybe center right A generation ago, we were center left. So we were able to convince large amounts of whites in the country that Jim Crow and segregation was wrong and something had to be done about it. I don't know if you can convince so many people today, the majority of whites, that African Americans and people of color suffer unduly. And the reason why that is, Jim, I think, is that because we don't have Jim Crow staring us in the face anymore. It's almost as if we needed segregation to be, a everyday reality for so many different people that people were able to respond to these calls for justice that began in the black community. But what's the injustice now? We know what the injustices are. It's the achievement gap. It's all these things. But I don't know if they galvanize the American public in a way to have the country do something about it. And that's what happened in the 60s. The country did something about segregation, almost en masse. And I'm not sure if we're there now, only because I think our politics are leaning more right. So what's interesting? If Hillary does decide to run and she gets the nomination, this will always tell you where we are in the country, at least on the Democratic side. How many times she will speak to the issues that resonated so much with the generation of the 60s. Barack Obama was able to do it in a real mild way, not strong. I mean, every time he tried to say, no, I'm not this sort of rabid progressive liberal, they wanted to push him back. So they wanted to associate him with Reverend Wright, who comes out of the Black Power movement. They wanted to associate him with various aspects of the civil rights movement, and he was not part of that tradition. He's not Reverend Jesse Jackson. He's not Al Sharpton. He comes from a different political tradition, although he benefited from that foundation. But so Hillary as well, we'll see, what kind of Democratic candidate she decides to be. My guess is it will be very centrist. It won't be progressive, and I think that's what Democrats have to do to win in these political times today, unfortunately.
Professor Keith Mayes, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.